I'm Liam.
I'm Wayne,
You're listening to In Film We Trust YouTube.
a place where we post clips from our recent episode.
All links down below in the description.
And now, on with the show.
For Peter Strickland's second feature film, we find ourselves in 1970s Italy at the titular Berberian sound studio, where the reserved Englishman Gilderoy has found himself hired to do post-production sound work on an Italian Giallo film, The Equestrian Vortex. Gilderoy finds himself at odds with the material and the production crew, where the lines between fiction and reality will soon begin to blur.
So to put Berberian into a bit of context, I think it's important to discuss a movie genre called Giallo.
Yep, Giallo, I'd say it's a mid-20th century kind of Italian film movement, for lack of better words.
Yes.
It kind of the term Giallo itself is Italian for yellow.
Yellow.
Yeah, it's as simple as that, which were kind of the covers of a series of pulp novels.
Pulp mystery novels.
Pulp, crime, mystery, them kind of novels. And they'd usually feature, short stories or something by, Agatha Christie, Raymond Chandler, authors of that ilk.
Yes, and they had a lot of important characteristics, and like you say, it started in the 20s, but...
20th century.
Yeah, but the 70s was when it really hit its commercial peak.
Yeah, and the first Giallo film, The Girl Who Knew Too Much,
Yes.
obviously a kind of nod to Hitchcock.
Hitchcock's films, yeah, it did have this very kind of Hitchcock-esque aesthetic.
Yeah, and The Girl Who Knew Too Much was directed by Mario Bava, who would go on to be an extremely influential director who's almost forgotten about in the English-speaking world.
Especially with Giallo directors, there's not that many that you would bring to mind and, like, everybody would know them. Even though they were heroes with their genre, it's like not a lot of people really knew who they were.
Yeah, through time they've almost become like a niche thing.
Yeah.
Whereas actually, when Giallo, or Gialli's the plural of Giallo, when Giallo was an actual contemporary movement, so to speak, these films were actually, for the most part, critically and commercially successful. They were making a lot of money at the box office.
Yeah, they were. But again, like you say, it was a very kind of niche market. But because they already had this background from the pulp novels and stuff,
Yeah.
they already had kind of an inbuilt audience that followed along to the movies.
Yeah, and kind of as Giallo went, because obviously Girl Who Knew Too Much was 1963, and the film what kind of revolutionized even the Giallo movement was The Bird with a Crystal Plumage by Dario Argento.
Dario Argento, yeah. If you said Giallo to me, the first director that would come to mind would be Dario Argento, because you could argue that he made the most, not only commercially successful, but most critically successful of the Giallo films.
Yeah, and he kind of started it. I suppose you could say like more lurid, a bit more violent.
Yes.
He kind of set the tone for the characteristics going forward in the genre.
You could say he kind of refined what would become the characteristic elements of the genre itself.
Definitely. Dario Argento's kind of high point, you could say, is Deep Red.
Deep Red.
Which starred British David Hemmings.
David Hemmings was in
Yeah,
that.
he was the main guy.
Yeah, it's been quite a long time since I've seen it. Another big influential one I'd written down, is it Tenebre?
Tenebre. That was kind of Argento's last, or one of his last forays into critical acclaim.
Yeah.
After that, as the 80s would progress, Giallo would fall out of commercial favour.
It doesn't matter how good you are at your genre. If the genre is not in vogue right now, then it's not going to get the attention it deserves.
Yeah, well, already from the start, some of the characteristics of these films, obviously murder, mystery type thing.
Shocking, really shocking, brutal violence.
And very, very stylized, very high concept set pieces.
And the camera work as well. It had very stylish camera work.
Yeah,
too.
You could almost call it flamboyant, couldn't you?
It did, yes.
And
yes.
the lighting especially was almost, had that Italian operatic feel.
There was some incredibly vivid colours.
Well, Suspiria, which...
That's the one I was thinking of, Suspiria, which is debated whether or not it's a Giallo film.
Yeah, I think Argento has gone on record as saying it's a supernatural Giallo.
Because, people said it's supernatural, but even then, Giallo there was supernatural elements in those.
To a point, but for the most part, you could just call them thrillers almost.
Yeah, so we have the shocking violence, very bloody death, stylish camera work. Also, something pointed out, a very, you could say, discomforting musical score, like very dissonant musical score being played throughout as well.
Oh yeah, there was a lot of. Can you remember like Rosemary's Baby and there was La La La? There was a lot of that, but amped up.
It was almost not music. It was almost like kind of vibrations in the soundtrack kind of thing.
And Goblin, who done a lot of Argento soundtracks, they were a progressive rock band in the 70s.
Yeah.
Who weren't really not too big, But when they started working for Argento, that's kind of when their career blossomed.
That's when they got recognition.
Yeah, and it kind of added a different element.
Yeah. Is it also true that Ennio Morricone did a lot of scores for Giallo films as
Oh,
well?
he done like Spasmo and stuff like that. Yeah, Ennio Morricone was into the kind of early 70s, I'd say.
But if I was to conjure up an image of Giallo right now, it would be like some kind of brutal murder or some kind of brutal attack with a very... It's almost like screeching soundtrack going on.
And typically
in the
a black-gloved killer.
Black-gloved killer, yes, exactly. And that's very important. That will get talked about later.
Which in
on as well.
Argento's films, Argento would actually be the black gloves.
Yeah, that's not surprising because you could get anybody to do that.
Yeah, well, even with Mario Bava in 1971, he directed a film called A Bay of Blood, which was actually copycatted by like Friday the 13th.
Yes.
Some of the similar kills.
I was going to say another one thing it led to is the Giallo films are often looked at as a precursor to like modern slasher films.
Yeah, especially with A Bay of Blood. And even films, I'm trying to think, in the 70s you had The Eyes of Laura Mars with Faye Dunaway. That you could almost class as an American Giallo.
Yeah.
And then you had Brian De Palma's work, Body Double, Dress to Kill, which these great set pieces. In Dress to Kill, there was a set piece in a museum. It's like a seductive scene where she's just following around this man who's into her, and he leaves a glove, obviously harking back to the black-gloved killer there, and then she follows him home and just these set pieces would eventually find their way into American cinema.
That's what I find interesting when you go back and watch these Giallo films, is you'll see this very kind of iconic scene. You think, where do I know that from? It's because you've seen it so many times in other films, but this is where the foundation was laid, you could say.
Yeah, and this is where Berberian actually comes into, because Berberian's not itself a Giallo.
No, it's definitely not.
But it's playing with the fundamentals of Giallo.
It has used elements of Giallo films to tell its story, you could say.
Yeah, and the film within the film, the Equestrian Vortex, is actually, you would say that's almost like the supernatural end of the Giallo film.
Yeah, especially with events that go on in the film, you can tell how it does have kind of supernatural elements in it.
And the thing that sets Berberian apart from a typical 70s, late 60s Giallo is Giallos were very heavily centered on women.
Yes, they were.
Whereas obviously in Berberian, where it's more of an internalized piece about Toby Jones's character, Gilderoy.
Yes, Gilderoy. What I thought interesting is Gilderoy, only one name. I'm guessing that would be his surname, because he's never called anything. It's only Gilderoy. He doesn't have a first name, surname, don't know, just Gilderoy.
Yeah, he's a peculiar guy.
He's a very strange guy, but I think if you're going to do that, someone like Toby Jones is the perfect kind of guy to play him.